I've been always working in small companies and startups. This means wearing a lot of hats and being a full-stack developer. But I was primarily a front-end developer lately because I wanted to go deeper in one direction rather than going wider in all directions and having shallow knowledge. Having said that, recently I was working on some backend tasks and it was cool experience that I could compare with the tools I had in 2018. So the startup I'm working at was participating in an acceleration program. It was kind of like YC but in Europe. Before the demo day, they gave us an advice to develop a feature that would benefit remote workers. That was a huge trend at the time. Our backend app runs on AWS infrastructure and we have ECS servers that run the backend application. We had tight schedule and we didn't want to disrupt the work of our backend and DevOps engineers while developing something that can be integrated in the existing system and improved in the future. Meet Amplify. I've used it to spun up SPA before. Turned out it can actually also generate infrastructure in command interface. I've researched it and developed the feature in a week, which is still running on production.
You've done a marvelous job.
Amplify lets you create AWS resources like a Lambda, REST API, database in CLI. So you just type something like amplify add API or amplify add function or amplify add storage. The way I used it is just to proxy some of our GraphQL requests through AWS Amplify to add some extra functionality. Everything was great, but what bothered me is that it was hard to tell what was the resulting infrastructure just by looking at the repository. When things didn't go as planned, I needed to change some obscure looking JSON files. You see, Amplify CLI generates CloudFormation JSON files, which is a brilliant service in its nature, but really hard to read for humans. So it felt like it has too much magic. Meet SAM. Later, I learned about AWS SAM from a team member. It looked promising, and since then I use it for my future similar projects like new integrations, background tasks, and even for a whole new functionality in a SaaS product. This is my preferred way of doing things in AWS now. Unlike Amplify, you generate the config manually, which makes you an expert in your infra. Also, since it's YAML file, you can take a brief look at the config and understand the whole infrastructure.
You get used to it. I don't even see the code. All I see is blonde, brunette, redhead.
So AWS SAM lets me create infrastructure from a config file in a declarative way. I can tell it that I need some code to run on API requests, and that code needs to have access to a persistent database. I'm still learning and Amazon keeps pushing new features, but let's go through the stuff I used in Anger in AWS SAM. My first task was to create a microservice and integrate in event-driven system. So I've created the Amazon Simple Queue service for getting requests, another SQS for publishing the results, and a Lambda for doing the job. Also, I needed S3 for saving images. Another service posted a message in the request queue. The Lambda was triggered, and then the Lambda posted message in the resulting queue. In the config, you need to declare a resource with type of SQS for request message and result messages. Create the Lambda, which has type of AWS serverless function. Add a property called events that has type of SQS. This will trigger the Lambda on a message in the request queue. Also, add the necessary policies for the Lambda to have access to resulting SQS and S3 bucket. This feels very holistic, logical to me. Under the hood, the resources connected by IDEs, but in the config, they are in the logical places. Another very useful feature of AWS SAM is an ability to create a GraphQL endpoint. It's really cool how you can declare the schema in the infra config. The schema is then automatically validated and introspection works out of box. I've declared basic CRUD methods. Then you declare AWS AppSync data source and a necessary policy for it. After that, you kind of tagging queries and mutations with your Lambda using AWS AppSync resolver. Then the Lambda have business logic with all sorts of edge cases handled. What's also very handy is that all the arguments already parsed and ready to be used by the code. Another time we needed to create an integration with Google Calendar. So we created REST API that is connected to Lambda. First, declare a resource called AWS serverless function. Add needed policies. In my case, I needed to store offline tokens, so I had to create a DynamoDB table and a policy for it. Creating a REST endpoint for the function is super easy. Just add a property called events that has all the REST endpoints. The other day I was doing R&D-like project that needed to broadcast some data with minimum delay among different client-facing actors. So the best and the quickest way to do it is socket.io. I thought about using API Gateway or AppSync, but it felt too complex and inefficient. Turned out there is an easy way of deploying web applications in AWS. Elastic Beanstalk supports several platforms like Java, Go, PHP, and of course Node.js. So you can spin up a server with WordPress, Laravel, Tomcat application on Java, or a Go server. And the best of all, you get proper monitoring and cluster management. Elastic Beanstalk checks up on health of your application and will restart if it goes down. Also, you can specify the number of nodes you need and it will spin up the copies of the server. And the best of all, it's free. Actually, you still pay for the resources you're using, like EC2 instances, S3 buckets that has the code, but the service itself is free. What I like about AWS SAM is that it's built on shoulders of AWS giants. And that giant is CloudFormation. CloudFormation is a tool for infrastructure management, just like SAM. You write a config file using JSON or YAML, then deploy it using CloudFormation, which creates the resources you specified in the file. SAM is basically stripped down CloudFormation, which is actually its added value. SAM is much more simpler and only targets serverless infrastructure, meaning that you cannot create EC2 instances in SAM, but you can do it in CloudFormation. But at the same time, SAM has useful shortcuts like events for lambdas. Let's compare the code in my repo with the generated CloudFormation request. The learning curve of AWS SAM is not that steep, but learning anything new is hard. So if you ever get stuck, try to Google what you're trying to make. For example, you can Google REST API AWS SAM, but if it didn't yield the desired results, try to Google the same thing but with CloudFront instead of AWS SAM. Also, there are cool serverless app examples on GitHub. where you can learn the SAM way of doing infrastructure. Other than that, Amazon's application repository has helped me finding the right architecture for my apps a couple of times. AWS SAM is not the only way of creating and maintaining infrastructure. If we are looking for creating services in AWS, you can also try Terraform, Architect, Amplify or CDK. I've personally only used SAM, but I know success stories for all the things I've listed. Amplify is much more than just infrastructure from a config. It can automatically detect your project characteristics and deploy needed resources accordingly. It has admin UI, it has branch-driven deployment, redirects, etc.
A real Swiss Army knife! Cool!
Whereas AWS SAM has one purpose, which is to describe and deploy infrastructure. AWS SAM is text-based and more primitive. It's more like using Markdown for text versus using WordPress or Ghost. You can use Amplify and SAM in the same stack at the same time, since it's much easier to plug and play a repository with static website to Amplify rather than implementing it from scratch in AWS SAM. I really like AWS SAM for creating infrastructure. It enables me to create valuable services with ease and extensibility. The declarative config makes sure that I leave usable heritage for the future devs.